Welcome to Ordinary Teachers and Students, where we get to hear teachers and students tell us their extraordinary stories. My hope is that through this podcast, ordinary teachers from around the world can relate to the stories they hear and get some timely suggestions and ideas. My name is Alan Cheng, and I'm a life coach as well as a university lecturer. My vision is to make life coaching a part of every school. Today, I'm delighted to invite Sadie Gardiner onto the podcast. I've never taught Sadie before, but I knew her because I saw her reading literally every time I saw her around school. She was the model student in terms of her love for reading. I joked on a number of occasions to my colleagues that we should make a statue of her in the library, so we're going to try to make that happen. But let's welcome Sadie.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
How are you today?
I'm a little sleepy, but I'm doing good.
So I know that you have just finished your Hong Kong DSE, so the public exams, right?
Yeah.
Would you want to talk about them on air or?
From my experience with the DSCs is a bit difficult. Well, not difficult, different, because for one of my electives, I chose Spanish. Okay. And in Hong Kong, the DSCs for Spanish take place much earlier. So yeah, I completed my Spanish DSCs last year in October. So I only had one elective to do, while everyone else had like 2 or 3.
So it was kind of less stressful in terms of the number of subjects that you had to take, right?
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. And how was your feeling overall? Did it go well? I mean, you don't need to predict your results on air, but
I don't want to say anything to jinx it, but I think I tried my best, and whatever happens, happens, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's all that matters, really, that you really tried your best, and hopefully things turn out well. And by the time this podcast is published, you might even have your DSE results. Let's see the timing of it. Right. Did you have anything to add to the intro? So obviously I just know you through my more informal interactions with you, where I just observe you reading all the time. Anything else that you wanted to tell our audience about you and who you are?
Well, I'm quite flattered that you suggested building a statue of me.
Yeah, so and I was very serious about it.
I'm fairly introverted, but my main hobbies are reading and drawing, but reading is kind of like the thing that stuck through me for the longest time. And it's always been there to like sort of emotionally support me. So that's why you might have seen me reading quite a bit.
I'm curious, like, do you feel the two things are connected? So as soon as you talk about reading and drawing, do the two things inspire one another, for example?
Oh, yes, definitely. Less so when I was younger. I feel like the way I read and the reasons why I read have developed quite a bit throughout so many years. But as for now, I do like to try drawing things based off of the books I read occasionally. It's just sort of like
cool.
An outlet. And thank you. And as someone who likes paying attention to things like movies and TV shows, and as someone who likes to follow animated shows a lot,
right? Yeah.
That can kind of intermingle with things like books and graphic novels and even manga series, and they all kind of become a big thing that inspire each other all the time.
Sure. It's really no, that's awesome, because I always tell people who are slightly good at art, or at least interested in art, that I'm super jealous. Like, so if you've ever been in my class before, I always just draw stick men, and so my stick men are probably quite ugly stick men as well. So I am very, very jealous of people who can draw well. Anything else you want to tell us about your school life, like just in general, just like how did you? I mean, obviously you've literally just finished your secondary school. You haven't even properly graduated yet. So, but how would you describe your school life? Maybe starting from primary school first.
Oh, that is quite difficult to summarize very quickly. My primary school experience and my secondary school experience are very, very difficult. Different. Why do I always say difficult? But in primary school, subconscious. My primary school experience wasn't that great, mostly because I had very, very few friends. And I'm half Chinese, so my dad's English and my mom is Chinese, and but both of my parents speak to me in English, and I grew up with them speaking to me in English a lot. But then I went to a local primary school, so most of my classmates had a much higher level in Chinese, and I had a
Yep.
much higher level in English than them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I struggled to connect to people a lot.
Mm.
And that's why it was a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
But when I
Yeah.
went to secondary school, because it's an EMI school, I met a lot of kids who also spoke English and watched the
Yeah.
same TV shows I watched and read the same
Mm.
book. So it was a little bit more easier then, and I made a lot of friends during these 6 years that I think hopefully I can stay as friends with for the rest of my life.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And it's fascinating because like when you talk about making friends at school, I think a big part of that was just whether you, like you said, watch the cartoons that other kids watch, right, at school.
Yeah.
So I am curious, when you were in primary school, like, so given that it was difficult to make friends, was there something that you did purposely or that teachers helped you to just kind of like, be more part of the whole class or whole group, as so to say?
I'll be honest, not really. There were very few teachers that I really liked in primary school. Um,
Mm,
there wasn't a lot of help. Like, I feel like part of it was a bit of my fault because I was quite introverted and I had
yeah,
no socializing skills whatsoever. So when
yeah.
there were some classmates who tried to be friends with me, I
Mm.
would always push them away.
Yeah.
But many of the teachers, I'll be honest, weren't very helpful. So I
Mm,
think that's why I ended up turning to reading a lot in primary school
that's
as like a
fascinating.
coping mechanism.
Yeah. I'm just curious. Do you feel that perhaps language was also an issue? So maybe that the primary school teachers were also perhaps a little bit intimidated that you might have spoken English better than them.
Maybe a little bit. I
Mm,
did learn Cantonese when I was small because
yeah.
my maternal grandparents, I see them quite often and they speak to me in
Mm,
Cantonese.
mm.
But when I first got into primary school as a 6-year-old, my Chinese level was still very, very low.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
genuinely believe that there were at times where I couldn't understand things during the
Mm,
lesson.
mm,
Um, I think the teachers, they weren't mean to me by any chance. It was more just sort of like,
mm.
in hindsight, when I look back on my memories, it was more so that they kind of felt like they didn't know what to do with me.
Were you the
And
only one? Like kind of as in the only kind of not well, I wouldn't classify you as a non-Chinese speaker, right? Because in Hong Kong we
yeah.
have the term like NCS, or non-Chinese speaking, but
Mm.
because you spoke some and you understood some, right? I mean, were you the only like foreign student in your class or your school?
In my form, yes. In my school, no. There
Mm,
was another girl a year younger than me who managed
right.
to who was a one, but she was a lot more successful in making friends than I was.
Was that because she spoke better Chinese, or just that her
I think
personality is
it's just
more?
personality
Yeah.
more so.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
So normally so we've got to know you a bit more now, like kind of like who you are and what your school life was like. And normally the middle part of the podcast is where we take a deep dive into a topic that you have
Mm.
chosen, and you have already subtly hinted how much you love reading on a number of occasions already. So we've only recorded for about 10 minutes, and you already mentioned reading quite a few times. I'm guessing that you're gonna tell us a little bit more about why you enjoy reading so much.
Well, I've kind of mentioned it a few times earlier, but
Yeah.
I think I don't think like it's weird because it's difficult to connect reading with education because not a lot of people actually pushed me to read. It was more so my own development. It's
Mm,
just something that happened naturally for me.
yep.
Uh my parents weren't exactly avid readers or anything. Like they
Mm.
didn't read me bedtime stories or anything, but
Oh,
my mom
okay.
used to read a lot when she was younger and
Okay.
she had a lot of those books left over. And there was this like
Ah,
sort of big bookshelf
yep,
in the small hallway in our house, and I
yep.
would just stare at that a lot when I was a kid, and I think that
Mm,
might have helped even though my parents didn't really push me in any direction.
that's so
and then
interesting. Yeah.
and then in primary school, because I didn't know how to make friends, and for some, I guess I was quite lucky, I never got really attached to digital devices
Mm,
at a
mm,
very young
mm,
age, so I ended up
mm,
reading a lot.
mm,
um
mm, mm.
and now it's the way I read has changed quite a bit because in primary school I used to read a lot mostly because I guess escapism. I just really,
Mm.
really hated primary school. I used to neglect doing my homework and read
Yeah.
instead.
Oh,
uh
really? Oh, wow.
yes, I
Did,
used to
didn't
do
see that
that.
side of you, but thank you for being honest.
Yes, I was not a great student in primary school. And what I did, I usually just read a book and then immediately pick up another one. Like I wouldn't really give
Yeah.
myself time to think about the book or anything in between.
Mm.
I used to, like, in my primary school library, we were allowed to borrow 2 books only, so the quota was 2. And I used to borrow 2
I like
books
how you emphasize
every single day.
only.
Yes, only. So I used to borrow 2 because it sucked during weekends. But I used to
Yeah.
borrow 2 books, read those 2 books, and then borrow 2 new books the next day.
Wow.
I used to read a lot of the Magic Treehouse series, so that's what
Yeah. I see a
happened.
lot of
Two of
kids
those
who
books.
love that. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
that's a lot
but
of information already. So
oh,
in
okay.
terms of parents not really pushing you, interestingly, right? But it's more the environment at home, right? You said there's some books available, and then at
Yeah.
school you also had a chance to borrow some books. Was there anything that the school did? Like, so at primary school, was there any reading programs that encourage you to read?
Not exactly. It's just usual the standard things that most English classes do. So sometimes the teachers will take you to the library and they'll ask you to
Yep.
pick a book. And then for
Mm-hmm.
homework, they'll ask you to do a reading report. But I think for me, it was quite easy because my
Mm.
English level was much higher than my peers.
Yep.
So
Mm.
the work wasn't very challenging for me at all. I just did what I
Mm.
usually did.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah, but our school had like these book report competitions for both Chinese and English.
Yep.
And I won the English book report for 4 years in a
Oh,
row.
not surprised at all.
It's my proudest achievement.
At private school, right?
Yeah,
Would it be a good guess if I said that you only did the book report homework and then you neglected all the other homework then, given what you said before?
possibly.
No.
English was my only good subject. I wasn't really good at anything else in primary school.
I'm curious. If you had to, or yet if you had the chance to redesign a book report, because I personally I have quite negative feelings about book reports, but just
Sure,
as a
yeah.
question, how might you redesign book reports to make them less kind of boring, or just something that you just copy the blurb and then that's it, kind of piece of work?
I think I think that is quite difficult. What I'd like is if teachers would try and help inspire students to think more about the book that they've just read. So
Mm.
maybe forming things like discussions, like a bit like a book club,
Yeah,
where they
yeah,
have to discuss what the book did and what they made you think. Because I think the problem with many book reports is that most students usually just give like a long summary of what the book is, and they
yeah,
don't really reflect on what the book is about
yeah.
or
Very
any
true. Yeah.
feelings. So I think if there's any sort of activities, whether it's
Mm.
like instead of writing a book report, maybe you can make a video or make a
Mm.
game or anything, just
Mm.
anything that sort of instigates discussion and
Yeah.
critical thinking about the book you just read is what I think would be best.
Yeah, sure. Because I remember you mentioned that when you were in primary school, like as a reader, you didn't really think too much about the book, right? You said you basically just
Yeah.
read a book, you started the next one, you read the next one. But does
Mm.
that mean that you have developed since then?
Yes, but not really because any teachers told me to, unfortunately.
Right, right,
Uh
right, right.
I think what really happened was in secondary school I discovered the online book community, and that was when things really
Ah, right.
changed.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Tell me more
uh,
about it. Yeah.
so I discovered a lot of what people called booktubers. So when you put book and
Mm,
YouTuber together, or
right.
other sort of influencers who make a lot of content and book reviews regarding books.
Mm,
And from
mm, mm.
there, I started getting a lot of recommendations. So my reading taste expanded, and
Yeah,
also there were a lot of people who really do put a lot of effort into giving really good book reviews, or like they
yeah.
give like book essay like essay
Right,
videos where they
right.
analyze the plot or characters.
Mm, mm.
And that made me think like, oh, this is actually really interesting, and it made me start to think a bit more about the books that I was reading.
Right. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And just observing the way you spoke about it, I think you found your community, right? You basically found where you belong. Would that be correct?
Sort of. It's a little, because for me, I'm actually not very I'm always been a bit shy to talk
Mm.
online. So I'm
Yep.
not
Yep.
someone who talks online very often, but it's just being able to read the things that other people have put out there or
Yeah.
watch
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
put
Sure.
out there. It's like, oh, there's other people out there who like the things that you like, and in that sense, it
Mm.
makes me feel comforted.
Mm, mm, mm. And you said that it's kind of expanded your the number, the type of books you read, right? So
Yes.
do you want to tell us a bit more? So before, what kind of books did you read, and now, how about now? What type of books do you read?
Um, okay, this is a bit difficult. How do I put this? So I'm a very big fantasy fan.
Yeah.
Just putting
Okay.
it out there. I'm trying to read more genres, but fantasy has kind of been the thing that stuck with me for the longest. So when I was in primary school, I tend to read a lot of more fast-paced action stories, and so things that valued plot more than character. And now I still really love adventure stories, but character does matter a little bit more to me. So I like it when characters are a little bit more three-dimensional and have more depth to them.
Yeah.
And because of the online community, I've discovered more nicher subgenres within fantasy, sort of. So something that I've been trying to read more is epic fantasy, which is fantasy that takes place in a completely fictional universe. And that's a very broad genre, but there's a lot of really long, thick fantasy series that like kind of intimidate people but are considered as classics that I really want to try and read more so that I can understand why people think this is so good and why people keep quoting them and referencing them all the time.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I've never heard of the like sub genre of epic fantasy. Are there more? So I'm guessing there are a lot more.
There are a lot. I mean, genre is like a really subjective term, so it's all up to you to decide. But I mean, there's things like darker fantasy or more horror fantasy, or like medieval fantasy. So there's a lot of fantasy, like stereotypical fantasy has a lot of European influences, right? So there's all like the knights and the European dragons. But more lately, especially with what people want more diverse stories, there's a lot of more serious fantasy stories that are being written or being published that don't use typical like medieval fantasy tropes, but maybe draw their inspiration from things like Asian or Southeast Asian mythologies or anywhere really. Like there's a lot of big series. No, actually, there's a lot of young adult novels lately that have been like retellings of old mythologies that have been really popular. So there's a lot of people who like to take old Greek stories, like I don't know, Hades and Persephone, and then make like a modern version of it or something. But then on the other hand, there's series that do like to just draw more diverse inspiration. Like there's a series that I quite enjoy called the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. It's heavily based on Southeast Asian sort of environments, and I watched a lot of interviews that the author did, and apparently when she was writing this book, she did a lot of research about criminal cartels in Asia, so that she could implement that into her book. And I think that's quite fascinating when authors draw on a lot of real life inspirations to make something very magical.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll try to include that in the show notes. I might ask you for a link later on to if in case people wanted to find that. You mentioned that you focus more on character than plot, or much more on character now, right? So you want them to be more three-dimensional. Like, is there a reason for that? Do you feel?
I don't know. For me, I've always been quite an introverted person, and it's quite difficult for me to relate to a lot of people my age because there's certain things that I don't experience very well, and like I don't really like going out very often. But when you read books, and especially when you read from well-written characters, you get to see the world from so many different perspectives.
That's so true.
And so I get to experience things that I technically don't experience.
Yeah. I can imagine. Absolutely. And that's one of the best things about reading, isn't it? Where you can experience what other people might be experiencing that you might not get a chance to. I am also curious, how's your reading in Chinese? I mean, all this reading that you talked about so far, is it all in English, or do you read in Chinese too?
Mostly in English. I've done some reading for Chinese, but it's less fiction. So something that I want to develop a little bit more is reading more literature. Like I do read it, but more like sort of classical older stuff. And for Chinese, I've discovered that I actually quite like Chinese poetry.
Oh, that's very interesting.
The only problem is my Chinese isn't very good, so I usually need to find someone to explain the poem to me before I can understand it.
Right. That's fine. But you appreciate the beauty behind the poem, right?
Yeah, I think it's really cool. And that's also something that's quite different, because when I was smaller, like in primary school, I was really scared of reading nonfiction or poetry. And now I'm a little bit more open to that. Like I remember I first read, like, this is a really weird thing to say. I first read The Fellowship of the Rings when I was about 12. I read the
Wow.
entire thing.
Wow.
And I didn't really learn anything from it, and I was a little bit bored by it. And which I think is a little bit of a shame. I didn't know how to appreciate the story at the time, because in the book there's a lot of like poems that the author has put in there himself. And I think if I were to reread that book now, I would appreciate it a lot more.
Yeah,
And like
absolutely. Yeah.
like appreciate the words and the writing and the poetry and things like that a bit
Yeah,
more.
yeah. I would love to hear your opinion. I've asked this question to quite a number of friends and colleagues.
Okay.
And I've developed over time as well in terms of my own reading habits. But do you reread books?
I do, but not as often as I like.
Tell me more. Tell me more. Do you have a
So I'm
system
not
to?
so there's quite a few reasons. For on one hand, I'm actually not that quick of a reader. Like I know that might come off. I read very quickly, but no, I take my time while I read. I'm quite slow, and my attention like gets unfocused really easily.
Okay.
And especially back when I first got into like online book culture, there was sort of there's a slightly unhealthy push for you to like read as much as possible. Like there's a lot of influencers out there who are reading like 200 books a year or something.
Yeah.
And so when I was quite small, I was like, okay, I need to read as much as possible and become one of those.
Yeah.
And also because school was really busy and there were so many books I wanted to read, I was like, oh, I really want to read these new books that people were talking about instead of rereading something that I already read. But now I'm trying to reread more often, especially with certain series. Like there's some book series that I know that have really, really detailed world building things going on. And they kind of reward readers who reread them. So if you reread the series, you get to notice small details and potential like foreshadowing. So if you already know the ending of the book, then you can catch all the hints that the authors put beforehand, and you can sort of appreciate the story more. And it's also just really fun to like go hunting for little Easter eggs.
Absolutely. But do you have any system that you developed, like, or is it more of a, I just remember, I saw the book, let me try to reread it?
It depends on the book series, because some book series are really, really different. For certain series, especially books that have a very large fan base, there'll already be a lot of fans who make a lot of like theory videos on the internet who analyze a lot of these things for you, so you don't have to do as much work and you kind of just read it for fun. But then there are other series that it is just really fun to be able to look for these details. So I'm going to give another example, I guess. There's a series called the Locked Tomb series by Tamsyn Muir, and it's like a science fiction fantasy mix. And I wouldn't really recommend it for younger readers, but it is very good. I've recently been rereading the first book, and I've been taking notes while I read it.
Wow, that's great.
So it's really interesting to notice all these little hidden details that the author puts in before.
And
it's quite fun.
Thank you for sharing that. And actually, one thing that you said earlier was that you mentioned that you're starting to read more like literature kind of stuff, right? It reminds me that you did not choose literature and English as one of your elective subjects, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually remember because I was still in school at that time, and we were all surprised, like Sadie not choosing the subject where she's allowed to read as much as she can. She's tested on what she's read, and was there a reason behind that? Like, why not choose literature and English?
Partially, it's kind of the school, because the way they put out the blocking,
right? Yeah.
So you could only pick certain subjects within a certain block, and you couldn't pick two subjects from the same block. And for me, I ended up going with geography instead of English literature, even though I really wanted to do both, is because I wanted to study history and geography in university in the future. And English literature was more sort of like I just really like reading sort of thing. And it was less it was less a thing that I planned on studying professionally in the future.
Right.
But I also do really like history. And I think the reason why I like history kind of ties into why I like reading so much a lot of the time. Because history is literally just a very, very long story that is still happening right now.
That is very true. Yeah.
And then it also ties into geography quite often. So I wanted to do that. And English literature was more sort of just like fun hobby thing for me instead.
So
I would definitely would have really liked to be able to implement
yeah.
things that I learned in geography and history into English literature, but I guess I just never got that opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, are you still hoping to study history and geography for at university after you finish? Well, I mean, you have finished your exams already, right? So next year, is
Yeah.
that your plan?
Yes, I'm probably going to study geography because that's what I have as an elective, and our school
Yep.
doesn't do history as an elective. But the goal is
Um,
to
mm,
what I would like is to pursue more human geography and
mm,
history. So things
mm.
along the lines of social sciences is what I'm interested in.
Sure, sure. It's good that you know quite well what you are interested in already. Right. Is there
Thank you.
anything that we haven't mentioned about reading that you think we need to mention? So you've already spoken quite a bit on your own reading habits, on how it's changed over time. Anything else that we've missed out?
I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about uh, I want the way teachers promote students to read to change a little
Yeah,
bit.
please, please, please. Yeah, yeah, that'll be great.
So one hand, I think teachers, if you think the students have gone into that certain level, to sort of try and encourage them to discuss about the book more and to
Mm, mm,
critically think about the book more rather than just reading it. And
mm.
on the other hand, there's some like I've met some teachers like this before, but especially I guess this is more of like within Hong Kong and maybe
Yep.
less international. But there's a lot of parents and teachers who think that reading fiction is like unhealthy, not productive,
Mm,
not good for you
mm,
at all. And it was like, you should be reading newspapers,
mm,
emails,
mm, mm,
articles.
mm,
You shouldn't be reading fiction. You shouldn't be
mm.
reading comics and things like that. And I think that is really, really like harmful
Mm,
for a kid, especially if they're really small. Like I think if a
mm,
teacher told me that,
mm,
if I
mm,
was like 6 year old, I
mm.
maybe would have like never touched Harry Potter.
Mm, mm,
um,
mm,
and
mm,
I think there's English is a language, right? Like there's many, and also with other languages, reading's not the only way you can learn it through from. So I
Yep.
think promoting students to learn language in things like TV shows or movies or even video games and reading
Yep.
graphic novels and sort of just opening their eyes a little bit to how much you can do with storytelling and how
Mm,
it's not just confined within a book, but with
mm,
so
mm,
many other genres or media. I think that's
mm, mm,
a
mm.
much more interesting way for kids to learn, right? And I think it's
Yep.
quite fun for them to know that, oh, like there's like a cartoon, like an animated movie that a kid really
Mm,
likes, and turns out you can talk so much about it, like you can
yep.
analyze so many things about it, and you
Mm,
can learn so much from it, and instead of just watching it as like a sort of fun thing. And I think
yep.
if teachers promote that a little bit more, it would be much more interesting for the
Yeah,
students.
sure. I completely agree. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Right. Are you ready to move on to the quickfire questions?
Sure.
Right. So how did teachers describe you at school? I mean, it's more of a present perfect. Sorry. How do teachers describe you right now, like from secondary school?
Depends on the teacher. I think most teachers tend to say I'm quite helpful in that
Yep.
I'm able to connect pretty well with my classmates. So
Mm,
I think that's
mm.
pretty good
Yeah, sure.
considering where I was in primary school.
Yep, yep. And what should schools or teachers do more of? And I'm going to push you beyond reading. So you've talked a lot about how to promote reading better, right? What else do you think schools or teachers should do more of? So you can think more about the holistic development of students.
Ooh, that is quite tricky. I think exposing them to more activities and more media is quite important. I think it's
Mm,
quite difficult to do in Hong Kong because the DSCs is sort of like so overbearing that
yeah,
all the teachers and students are just kind of like, we need to focus as much on DSC as
yeah,
possible.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
if that wasn't something in the way, I would like just being able to have more different experiences.
Mm,
So going on trips or having activities, even
yep.
at school, like and holding more discussions and things like that, and
Mm,
trying to listen to what the students want and
mm,
finding a way to make it fun and also educational would
mm,
be. But
mm.
I think that's a very vague answer, but I hope that makes
No,
sense.
no, no, that makes sense. Total sense. Yeah. How about less of? Doing
Less
less of.
of,
Yeah.
oh, less stress. That's not
So
really
try
an
to
answer.
reduce the stress of
Yes,
students, right?
I think because the DSCs is just so all over the place. One thing I don't like that the English DSCs promote quite a bit in particular
Mm.
is that all the text they give you is mostly nonfiction,
Very
which
true.
is fine
Yeah. Mm.
because it is quite useful on a professional level. But what happens is, especially with lots of students, is that they don't learn English in a sort of natural way. And so even students who get really, really high marks in English, if they were to go to a random city in England, they might not be able to communicate with people very well because they're not
Yeah.
aware of like different culture or even different accents. They won't be
Yeah.
able to understand that. And I think that's something quite practical that should be addressed a little bit more, or like
Yeah.
accents or cultural differences and things like that could be quite
Sure.
useful and very important to learning a language, I think.
Yeah, totally. And what do you think? So when you reflect back on your school life, it could be primary, it could be secondary. What do you think has been the most helpful tool or activity that you think has really boosted your learning?
Mm. I quite liked in junior form in particular, when we had more time and stress, there was these assignments where you could write a short story.
Yeah.
And while of course being graded on something subjective is a little bit stressful, but I was small, so I didn't care. And I never really tried writing before. So at that time, every time we got like a short, I never really tried writing, which is weird considering how much I read. But every time we got a short story assignment, I would shift. Like I noticed this subconscious, like it was subconscious, but after I read my old works, the tone of the story that I wrote it in is directly based on what I had recently just read.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
really
absolutely.
fun. Yeah, so there was a story I remember writing in Form 2 where I put like a lot of jokes and it was all in first person, and I realized that was because I had just read Percy Jackson.
That's so fun. Like you're kind of almost finding your own little clues that of your how you were like back then, right? When you reread those.
It was
That's
quite fun for me to notice that, so I say that was quite educational.
Sure. So do you have any funny or strange or scary or touching moments from your school life that you want to share with us?
I guess in terms of touching, for 3 years I had the same English teacher in junior form, and she was
And
really,
I know
really
who she was.
yes, she
Do you have
was
anything to say
really,
to
really...
her? Yeah.
Oh, if you're listening to this, thank you so much. You mean a lot to me, because she meant a lot to me mostly because she was the first adult I had ever met at the time who actively read children books and
That's
fiction,
fascinating.
which is
Yeah.
like, it sounds like a really stupid thing to say because all the authors who write children novels are all adults themselves. But like my parents didn't really read a lot of things that I read, and I didn't have a lot of friends and things like that. So she was the first adult who was like reading a lot of children books or young adult books and a lot of fiction, and she was being really, really open to discussion, and she would encourage me a little bit. So sometimes if I had just read a book that she had also read, she would ask me some questions. Oh, what did you think? What did you think of this and that? And that gave me the chance to like talk. And she was just very, very kind, and someone that she was very willing to listen to my very excited ramble, the book that I liked.
Absolutely.
So she was very...
and I would. I'm sure we'll share this podcast with her when it's out. And funnily, this morning someone shared with me. So one of my friends shared with me an article from the BBC called "Why Adults Should Read Children's Books." So I'm going to share that with you afterwards. I think absolutely, I think what you said is so true, and definitely thank you for sharing this touching. Or actually, I mean, like obviously that the fact that you still remember this teacher from your junior form years, I think shows a lot. Right. What's one question you have for me? Like, I mean, I've asked you loads of
Could I just
questions so
add
far.
something in from
Oh, yeah,
earlier?
please do. Yep, go for it.
Similar thing like with animated shows and TV is that a lot of adults kind of see them as something for kids, which is a little sad. And I like how the perception is changing quite a bit with a lot of big animated shows getting big awards. But I still think that's something that should be changed. Like my parents still sometimes are a bit skeptical at watching animated shows because they think it's for kids, when it's really just a medium.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
True.
In terms of questions I'd like to ask you, I know you explained this in some of your earlier podcasts, but I was curious if there were any other people who inspired you to make the podcast. Like, were there something that you had read or a person you had met that made you go like, oh, I really want to start asking people?
That's a very interesting question. I think my immediate thought is that I am a very big podcast listener. So I think it was like kind of accelerated during COVID, because obviously during COVID we were kind of stuck in our homes, right? And I really listened to a lot more podcasts during that time. And there was a moment where I started to realize, oh wait, I can literally just learn anything I want from listening to podcasts. I mean, similar to reading books and watching YouTube videos, right? It just opened this channel of learning. And there are a couple of podcasters that I particularly admire. You probably won't know their names, but there's one called Adam Grant. He's a psychologist. Another one's Simon Sinek. He's not a psychologist. What is he? He's kind of like an influencer kind of thing. But yeah, so I have a few that I go to who really, really inspire me in terms of them trying to send out messages to the world and help people learn. And I think the one thing that really made me want to make a podcast myself is that I feel it can help teachers. I think that's the biggest thing, that I just want more teachers to, I mean, listen to your story. I think what we heard today was absolutely amazing, because you have such an amazing story. And the Sadie that we saw in secondary school is very different from the Sadie that we saw in primary school, right? So my hope is that a primary school teacher listening to this podcast might think, oh, wait, I have a Sadie in my class right now. Maybe I could do something more to integrate her into the class and so on, right? So yeah, that's my long answer to your question.
Thank you. That was really sweet.
Yeah. And one last question for you then. So it's more of a reflective question. So if you could change one thing about how you approach school, what might you change?
Okay. Specifically with primary school, I think at the time I didn't really understand the importance of education in general. So like I would sit in math class and go like, when am I going to have to calculate the area of a triangle when I'm an adult, and things like that. So
we all go through that phase, yeah.
Yes. But I think maybe because I've discovered that I do quite like learning, even though my talent may not necessarily lie with maths. If I were to re-go through primary school or secondary school, I would try and do that through a much more open-minded way and be a lot more willing to learn things. Even if it's something that I don't think will be useful to me, I'll try and see if there's a way that I can implement this in something that I like, or something that is useful for me. Like, I think maths have helped me train my brain to think quicker, even though I still don't really like maths. But I think I would try and see things in slightly more different angles and more nuanced ways.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sadie. And once again, thank you for coming on to the podcast. So you've been such a...
Thank you.
I think if people could see you during the video, so obviously we're doing a video recording right now, but later in the podcast we can't see you, but that's just the energy, your facial emotion, your body language. Like when you talk about reading, it's just absolutely amazing. Like I'm going to share this podcast with a librarian that I know as well, just because I think she'll appreciate it so much, how much you enjoy reading. You're such a role model.
Right next to me.
I know. So I'm hoping we can get working on that statue for you of being such a good reader. But once again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your love for reading.
Thank you for inviting me. It was quite fun.
I'm sure you can tell how much Sadie loves reading, and it's quite amazing how it took very little pushing or pulling from parents and teachers. She also gave us some tips on how to promote reading. The first being giving opportunities for students to discuss what they've read, so it's a chance for them to reflect on how what they've read relates to their own lives. The next thing would be to allow students to read any genre, even things like comic books, because any reading is better than no reading. And finally, teachers could try reading the books that students are reading, and I think you can see the impact that had on Sadie. And when we read the books that students are reading, students might find that actually what they're doing is something that is quite meaningful. So I hope you enjoyed listening to Sadie's extraordinary story, and I hope you join us again next time on Ordinary Teachers and Students.